You were never meant to chase success as if it were something outside of you, because the moment you believe it exists somewhere beyond your reach, you begin to organize your entire life around absence rather than presence, around lack rather than identity, around effort rather than alignment. And in that subtle misunderstanding, most people unknowingly build a lifetime of limitation. The truth is that everything you are experiencing right now is an external reflection of an internal blueprint that has been silently running your life, not your circumstances, not your education, not your past failures, but the invisible paradigm that governs how you see yourself and what you believe you are allowed to receive. This is why two people can live in the same city, under the same conditions, facing the same economy, and yet one expands while the other contracts. One recognizes opportunity where the other sees obstruction. One expects abundance where the other anticipates struggle. What separates them is not talent, it is not luck, it is identity. When Bob Proctor spoke about paradigms, he was pointing towards something most people overlook because it is too close, too constant, too familiar to be questioned. Your paradigm is not what you think about occasionally, it is what you accept as true without thinking at all. It is the silent operating system beneath your conscious thoughts. And here is where transformation begins to feel almost unsettling. Because if your life is a reflection of your paradigm, then your results are not random. They are predictable. They are measurable expressions of your self-image, which means nothing changes until you change the image you hold of yourself. Most people try to improve their lives by adjusting actions, but actions are only symptoms. They are echoes of identity. You can discipline yourself into new behaviors for a time, but if your self-image remains unchanged, the old identity will eventually reclaim control. You will return to what feels familiar, not what feels ideal. So the real question becomes uncomfortable yet liberating. Who are you being when no one is watching? What identity do you unconsciously defend when life challenges you? Because that identity is not just influencing your decisions, it is creating your results. There is a deeper intelligence at work here, something that ancient philosophers and modern success teachers alike have hinted at. You do not attract what you want, you attract what you are in harmony with. Your emotional state, your expectations, your inner certainty, these are not passive experiences. They are creative forces shaping your reality. And when you begin to understand this, you realize that struggle is often not a lack of opportunity, but a misalignment of consciousness. You are not blocked by the world. You are filtered by your own beliefs. The science of getting rich expressed a principle that feels almost too simple at first, yet it carries profound implications. Thought, sustained with purpose and feeling, becomes the architect of form. Not wishful thinking, not passive hope, but directed consciousness combined with emotional certainty. Now imagine what that means about your current life. Every recurring thought you entertain about money, worth, possibility, and success is not just commentary. It is instruction. It is programming the direction of your future experiences. But here is where most people hesitate. They try to change thoughts without changing identity. They attempt to think rich while feeling poor. They attempt to visualize success while internally rehearsing doubt. And the subconscious always obeys what feels true at the deepest level, not what is temporarily imagined. There is a moment in every transformation where the old identity resists. It disguises itself as logic. It whispers caution. It presents past evidence as proof of permanence. But what it is really doing is defending familiarity, not truth. And if you can observe it without obedience, something begins to shift. There was once a man who worked in a small warehouse, living paycheck to paycheck, convinced that financial freedom was reserved for other kinds of people. He would listen to success teachings at night, but every morning he would return to the same internal narrative. People like me don't get ahead. One day something subtle changed. He stopped asking how to get more money and started questioning who he was being when he thought about money. That question disrupted something deeper than his habits. It challenged his identity. He began to notice how often he rehearsed limitation, how often he described himself as behind, how often he used his past as a prediction of his future. And instead of fighting these thoughts, he observed them as if they belonged to an old version of himself that was no longer required. At first, nothing in his external life changed, but internally, he began to occupy a different state of being. He stopped identifying as someone trying to become successful and started embodying someone who already belonged in that reality. His decisions became quieter, more certain. His conversations shifted. His posture changed. Even his tolerance for mediocrity diminished. Months later, an opportunity came through a casual conversation, not because he was searching desperately, but because his internal state had become receptive. Within a year, he transitioned into a completely different career path that multiplied his income and redefined his sense of possibility. Nothing miraculous happened externally at first. The miracle was internal alignment. This is the invisible mechanism most people overlook. Reality does not respond to your urgency. It responds to your state of being. And your state of being is shaped by repetition. Repetition of thought, repetition of emotion, repetition of identity. That is why transformation feels slow at first. Not because it is difficult, but because the old paradigm resists replacement until it is no longer reinforced. You are not being asked to become someone new in the superficial sense. You are being invited to remember a version of yourself that is not conditioned by past limitation, a version that operates from expectation rather than doubt, from expansion rather than contraction. What would change if you stopped negotiating with your limitations? What would happen if you treated your current identity as something editable rather than permanent? These are not philosophical questions, they are structural ones, because the moment your identity shifts, your behavior follows without force. You begin to notice opportunities you previously ignored. You begin to act without excessive hesitation. You begin to make decisions that feel aligned rather than reactive. And over time, what once felt improbable becomes inevitable. The deeper realization is this: you are always in a state of creation, even when you are not consciously directing it. The only difference between unconscious creation and intentional creation is awareness. And once awareness enters, innocence ends. You can no longer claim ignorance of your inner world. You begin to see the connection between thought and experience, between self-image and outcome, between belief and result. At that point, life stops feeling like something happening to you and begins revealing itself as something happening through you. And in that recognition, there is a quiet power, not loud or forceful, but steady and undeniable. The kind of power that does not need to prove itself because it is grounded in understanding. You were never meant to struggle endlessly with reality as if it were separate from you. You were meant to participate in its formation through the conscious refinement of who you choose to be. And when you finally see that clearly, not as theory but as lived awareness, something within you settles. You stop reaching outward for what was always waiting to be expressed inwardly. You begin to embody the identity that makes your desired life not just possible, but natural. That is the moment everything begins to reorganize itself around you. Not because the world changed first, but because you did. If this message resonates with you, subscribe to Proctor Mindset Lab and begin transforming your mind today. If identity is the foundation of creation, then the next question is not how do you change your life, but how do you change the layer of mind that resists change even when you consciously desire it? Because there is a part of you that agrees with inspiration in moments of clarity, and yet another part that quietly restores old patterns the moment emotional intensity fades. This is the subtle conflict most people live inside without recognizing it. They are not failing because they lack information. They are fragmenting between awareness and conditioning, between what they intellectually understand and what they emotionally embody. The subconscious does not respond to arguments. It responds to repetition with feeling. That is why knowledge alone never transforms a life. You can understand every principle of success and still remain unchanged if your internal emotional state continues to rehearse the same identity. So real transformation begins when awareness is no longer passive observation, but active participation in reconditioning the inner world, not by force, not by struggle, but by deliberate repetition of new emotional states until they become familiar enough to be accepted as truth. This is where meditation becomes something far more practical than relaxation. It becomes a rehearsal space for identity, a controlled environment where you stop reacting to external evidence and begin generating internal certainty independent of circumstances. When Bob Proctor described aligning thought and feeling, he was pointing toward this convergence point where imagination becomes more real than memory, because memory anchors you to the past, while imagination gives structure to the future. And whichever one carries more emotional weight will determine your direction. Most people unintentionally meditate on limitation every day. They replay past mistakes, rehearse financial stress, and re-experience emotional doubt with such consistency that it becomes their baseline vibration. Then they wonder why new outcomes feel distant. But if you were to consciously redirect that same faculty of attention, something profound begins to shift. You begin to notice that your mind is not a prisoner of external reality. It is an instrument that can be tuned, and tuning requires stillness. Not silence in the absence of thought, but stillness in the absence of identification with thought, because thoughts will arise regardless. The difference is whether you inhabit them or observe them. There is a subtle moment during this practice where you begin to sense that you are not the thinker of every thought. You are the awareness in which thought appears. And in that gap, however small at first, conditioning begins to loosen its grip. This is not abstract philosophy. It has direct consequences on how you make decisions. Because when you are identified with fear, your decisions are defensive. When you are identified with scarcity, your decisions are restrictive. But when you operate from a state of inner sufficiency, even before external validation, your decisions expand your possibilities. You stop asking, what is the safest option? And begin asking, what is the most aligned expression of who I am becoming? That shift alone begins to reorganize your trajectory. And yet the mind will resist this transition because it prefers certainty over expansion. Even negative certainty feels safer than unknown possibility. This is why people remain stuck, not because they lack opportunity, but because they overvalue familiarity. The subconscious mind is essentially a habit-forming mechanism. It records emotional patterns and then seeks to repeat them to preserve identity consistency. So if your self-image has been built around struggle, then ease will initially feel uncomfortable. If your identity has been shaped around limitation, then expansion will feel unnatural. This is why transformation often feels like instability before it feels like progress, because you are temporarily without a fixed identity. The old one is dissolving and the new one has not yet stabilized. During this phase, emotional discipline becomes more important than external action. Not discipline as force, but discipline as observation. The ability to notice old patterns without reinforcing them. To witness doubt without obeying it, to feel resistance without becoming it. There is a quiet intelligence in doing less from the old identity and more from the emerging one, because every action you take from the old self reinforces its continuity, and every action you take from the new self strengthens its embodiment. Over time, the nervous system begins to adjust. What once felt like effort begins to feel like normality. What once felt foreign begins to feel natural. And this is the real sign of reprogramming, not emotional excitement, but emotional neutrality toward higher standards of living. There is also a deeper layer that most people overlook entirely, and that is frequency, not as mystical abstraction, but as emotional consistency. Your dominant emotional state becomes the filter through which you interpret reality. Two people can experience the same event and extract entirely different meanings because they are operating from different internal frequencies. One interprets challenge as confirmation of failure. Another interprets it as refinement of direction. The external event is identical, but the internal state produces different realities. This is why emotional mastery is not about positivity. It is about stability, the ability to return to alignment without needing external permission, to recalibrate internally rather than react externally. When you begin practicing this consistently, something subtle yet powerful happens. You stop over-identifying with outcomes. You begin to recognize that outcomes are delayed reflections, not immediate truths. They are echoes of past identity, not definitions of current potential. And that recognition frees you from emotional volatility. You begin to act from clarity rather than compulsion, from intention rather than reaction, from vision rather than history. At this stage, success is no longer something you pursue. It becomes something you allow through alignment. And yet there will still be moments when the old identity resurfaces. It will speak through doubt, comparison, and impatience. It will attempt to reclaim authority by reminding you of time, evidence, and external validation. But now you begin to see it differently, not as truth, but as residue, not as instruction, but as memory. And in that distinction, you gain space. Space to choose again. Space to return to alignment. Space to remember that your current reality is not your final form, but your most recent expression. And with each return, the new identity strengthens, not through force, but through familiarity, until eventually what once required conscious effort becomes unconscious expression. At that point, you are no longer trying to become abundant. You are thinking, deciding, and perceiving from an abundant identity. You are no longer attempting to be confident. You are operating from self-trust as a default state. And the external world, without negotiation, begins to reorganize itself around that internal consistency because it was never responding to your wishes. It was responding to your being. And when that understanding becomes lived rather than intellectual, something profound settles within you. The search ends not because you have arrived somewhere external, but because you have returned to the internal source from which everything was always emerging. There is a point in every real transformation where seeking begins to feel unnecessary, not because ambition disappears, but because the compulsive tension behind it dissolves. You stop reaching for life as if it is withholding something from you, and instead begin to recognize that life has always been responding accurately to the internal instructions you were unaware you were giving. This is where a quieter form of intelligence begins to emerge. Not the loud intelligence of analysis, but the subtle intelligence of observation. You begin to notice that your mind has been narrating your limitations so consistently that you mistook narration for reality itself. And once you see the narration, you can no longer fully believe it in the same way. This is the threshold where many people pause, not because they lack understanding, but because understanding begins to destabilize the identity they have depended on, the identity that was built around struggle, effort, delay, and justification. Even suffering, when familiar enough, becomes a kind of psychological home. But something within you already knows that home was never meant to be permanent. The deeper invitation here is not to improve your old identity, but to stop defending it, because the more you defend it, the more you reinforce its structure. And the more you reinforce it, the more your external world must mirror it back to you with precision. There is a reason change often feels uncomfortable even when it is positive. The subconscious does not evaluate experiences based on benefit. It evaluates them based on familiarity. So anything unfamiliar, even if it leads to expansion, initially triggers resistance. This is why many people retreat just before breakthrough moments. Not because the opportunity was not real, but because the internal identity could not yet hold the reality it was approaching. And so the process of transformation is not a sudden leap, but a gradual expansion of identity capacity. You are not merely learning new skills, you are expanding the emotional and psychological container that determines what you believe you can sustain. This is where patience becomes misunderstood. Most people think patience means waiting for external change. But true patience is the ability to remain aligned internally while external evidence catches up. And that requires a level of trust that is not based on what you see, but on what you now understand about causation itself. You begin to see that your life is not reacting randomly. It is organizing itself around patterns of thought that have been emotionally reinforced. And because of that, repetition becomes more powerful than intensity. One thought, revisited with emotional weight, becomes more influential than 100 scattered intentions. This is why consistency in inner dialogue matters more than occasional bursts of motivation. Motivation is temporary alignment. Identity is sustained alignment. And only sustained alignment produces structural change in experience. There is a subtle shift that begins to happen when you internalize this. You stop trying to force outcomes and start refining states. You become more interested in how you are being while doing things than in what you are doing alone, because you realize that identical actions taken from different states produce entirely different realities. Two people can make the same phone call, apply for the same opportunity, or enter the same room, yet the energy of their identity determines how reality responds to them, not in a mystical sense, but in behavioral, perceptual, and relational feedback loops that shape opportunity itself. People respond differently, you notice differently, you interpret differently, and over time, those micro differences accumulate into entirely different life trajectories. This is why self-image is not just personal psychology, it is practical destiny formation. There is a moment in the life of one ordinary woman that illustrates this principle with striking clarity. She was not seeking transformation in any dramatic sense. Her life was stable but constrained. She worked in administration, lived cautiously, and rarely made decisions that deviated from what felt predictable. Her internal dialogue was consistent but limiting. She often thought of herself as someone who does enough, but not more than enough. That phrase was not dramatic, but it quietly shaped her entire existence. One day she encountered the idea that her self-concept was not fixed. At first she dismissed it as overly idealistic, but something about the idea lingered, not as belief, but as curiosity. She began to observe herself in daily moments, not changing anything at first, just noticing how often she deferred decisions, how often she assumed she was not qualified for certain conversations, how often she minimized her own ideas before sharing them. What she discovered was not failure, but pattern. And once a pattern is seen clearly, it becomes harder to unconsciously obey. She did not transform overnight. Instead, she began introducing small deviations from her old identity, speaking up once when she would have stayed silent, applying for something slightly beyond her perceived level, allowing herself to be seen in spaces she previously avoided. At first, these actions felt disproportionate to her identity, almost uncomfortable. But over time, discomfort gave way to familiarity, and familiarity gave birth to expansion. Months later, she found herself in a role she would have previously assumed was reserved for a different type of person, not because she became someone else, but because her definition of herself expanded enough to include what was previously excluded. What changed was not the world's generosity toward her, but her capacity to inhabit a larger version of herself without psychological rejection. And that is the real mechanism behind transformation. Not force, not struggle, but inclusion of a new identity until it becomes natural. This is also why comparison is one of the most subtle forms of identity regression. When you compare yourself to others, you temporarily step out of your own developmental trajectory and attempt to evaluate yourself using someone else's internal timeline. But your expansion is not linear in comparison to others. It is structural in relation to your own paradigm. And every time you return to comparison, you weaken your alignment with that structure. There comes a stage where you begin to recognize that the only meaningful comparison is between who you are being now and who you are capable of embodying when conditioned limitations are removed. And that comparison is not discouraging, it is clarifying, because it reveals that the gap you perceive is not a gap of ability, but a gap of identity permission. You already contain the intelligence required for your next level. What changes is your willingness to occupy the state from which that intelligence is naturally expressed. And as this understanding deepens, striving begins to soften, not into passivity, but into precision. You stop scattering energy through doubt and begin directing it through clarity. You become more intentional with attention itself because you realize attention is the bridge between thought and manifestation. Where attention goes, emotional reinforcement follows. And where emotional reinforcement persists, identity stabilizes. And once identity stabilizes, reality reorganizes accordingly. At that point, life no longer feels like something you were trying to catch up with. It begins to feel like something that is unfolding through you in direct response to your internal coherence. And in that coherence, there is a quiet kind of power that does not announce itself, does not argue for validation, and does not depend on external confirmation. It simply expresses, and in its expression, everything begins to align. There is a deeper threshold in this journey where even the idea of becoming begins to feel incomplete, because becoming still implies distance between who you are and who you think you need to be. And that subtle sense of distance is exactly what keeps identity in motion without resolution. At some point, you begin to notice that transformation was never about arriving somewhere new, but about removing the distortions that made you forget what was already present. Not adding more to yourself, but subtracting everything that contradicts your natural state of expansion. And this realization shifts everything. Because when you stop trying to become, you begin to observe what has always been operating beneath the noise of conditioning. A quieter intelligence, a more stable sense of awareness, a version of you that does not negotiate with fear before every decision. Most people never encounter this layer of themselves clearly because they are too occupied with internal dialogue, a constant commentary about what is missing, what might go wrong, what has not yet happened. And that commentary becomes so habitual that silence feels unfamiliar, even threatening. But silence is not emptiness. It is clarity without distortion. And in that clarity, something subtle begins to reorganize your perception of reality. You start to see that your life has never been random. It has been structured around the emotional instructions you consistently give to your subconscious mind. Not once, not occasionally, but repeatedly, until they became identity. This is why temporary change is easy, but sustained transformation is rare, because the subconscious does not respond to inspiration. It responds to identity saturation. What you repeatedly feel is true becomes the governing assumption of your experience. And this is where discipline takes on a different meaning. Not discipline as suppression, but discipline as emotional selection. The ability to choose which internal states you continue to rehearse and which ones you no longer entertain as valid versions of yourself. This is not about positive thinking. It is about selective embodiment. You are no longer trying to think differently. You are deciding which version of you is allowed to remain active in your psychological space. And every time you return to an old identity pattern, you are not failing. You are rehearsing familiarity. But once you see it clearly, repetition becomes a choice rather than an unconscious cycle. There is a point where you begin to notice how quickly thought becomes identity when it is emotionally reinforced. A single thought, if repeatedly felt, begins to shape posture, tone, decision-making, and perception. And over time, those subtle shifts accumulate into a recognizable life pattern. This is why your external world always feels consistent with your internal narrative, even when you are trying to change it, because the narrative has not yet changed at the level of emotional conviction. An emotional conviction cannot be faked. It must be cultivated through repeated experience of thinking, feeling, and acting as if a new identity is already operational. This is where imagination becomes one of the most underutilized tools of transformation. Not imagination as escape, but imagination as rehearsal of internal reality. When you consciously imagine yourself responding differently, deciding differently, and perceiving differently, you are not pretending, you are training. You are introducing new neurological patterns that, when repeated, begin to feel natural enough to become automatic. And what becomes automatic becomes identity. There is a moment in this process where external evidence still reflects the old identity, while internal experience begins to reflect the new one. And this gap can feel disorienting if you misinterpret it, because it may appear as though nothing is changing, when in reality everything is reorganizing beneath the surface. The external world always lags behind internal coherence. It must, because it is an echo, not a source. This is where many people lose patience with their own evolution. They judge progress by visible change rather than internal alignment. But visible change is the final stage of transformation, not the beginning. Before reality shifts, identity stabilizes. Before identity stabilizes, emotional repetition occurs. Before emotional repetition, awareness interrupts old patterns. And before awareness, there is often discomfort. Discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of reorganization. There is also a subtle emotional shift that happens when you stop identifying with your limitations as permanent truths. They begin to feel like habits rather than definitions. And once something is seen as a habit, it can be changed, not instantly, but intentionally. This is where responsibility becomes empowering rather than heavy, because you are no longer responsible for controlling outcomes. You are responsible for maintaining coherence within your internal state. And coherence is the alignment between thought, emotion, and action. When those three elements move in the same direction consistently, life begins to respond with surprising clarity. There is less confusion, less fragmentation, less internal resistance, and more certainty, not because everything is known, but because your internal reference point becomes stable. At this stage, you begin to notice that opportunity was never absent. It was simply unnoticed, not because it was hidden from you, but because your attention was previously trained to scan for limitation rather than possibility. Attention is a filtering mechanism. It determines what you perceive as relevant, and what you perceive as relevant becomes your lived reality. So when attention shifts, perception shifts. And when perception shifts, experience follows. This is why two people standing in the same situation can inhabit completely different realities. One sees constraint, the other sees entry points. One sees delay, the other sees timing. One sees rejection, the other sees redirection. The external world is shared. The interpreted world is not. And it is the interpreted world that determines direction. There is a woman who once believed she had missed her opportunity to create financial independence. She had experienced setbacks that seemed to confirm this belief, and over time she stopped considering possibilities that required risk or expansion. Her life became smaller, not externally forced, but internally permitted. She described herself as realistic, but in truth, she was operating from a filtered perception of what she believed was still available to her. One day, she began noticing how often she used the phrase, "That's not for me." Not in dramatic moments, but in ordinary decisions. Opportunities, conversations, ideas, each one filtered through an unconscious identity boundary. Once she saw the pattern, she could not unsee it. And something subtle shifted. She did not immediately pursue dramatic change. Instead, she began allowing small breaches in her old identity, accepting invitations she would normally decline, exploring ideas she would normally dismiss, engaging in conversations she would normally avoid. These were not dramatic actions, but they were identity disruptions. And identity disruptions, when repeated, become identity expansions. Over time, her internal definition of what was possible for her began to widen. And as it widened, her decisions naturally followed, not through force, but through alignment. Eventually, she transitioned into a path that once felt inaccessible, not because the external world changed its rules, but because she changed her internal permission structure. And that is the real shift most people overlook. The world does not expand for you. Your identity expands within it. And suddenly more of it becomes visible and accessible. At a certain level of awareness, you begin to understand that life is not withholding opportunities from you. It is revealing only what your current identity can interpret and integrate without contradiction. So expansion is not about forcing life to give more. It is about becoming the kind of identity that can perceive more without psychological resistance. And when that happens, effort begins to feel different. Less strained, more directed, less scattered, more intentional, because you are no longer operating from uncertainty about who you are. You are operating from recognition of what you are already becoming. And that recognition, when stabilized, becomes the foundation upon which everything else begins to reorganize itself naturally.
What we have been exploring is not just motivation or philosophy. It is a very practical understanding of how a human life is actually constructed from the inside out. When you strip away all the noise, all the opinions, all the external circumstances, you begin to see something very simple and very powerful. Your life is being shaped by a mental blueprint that most people never consciously examine. That blueprint is what we call the subconscious mind, and it is not something mystical or distant. It is simply the part of your mind that runs automatically. It handles your habits, your emotional reactions, your self-talk, and your default decisions without you needing to think about them. In other words, it is the part of you that is operating your life, while your conscious mind is often distracted. If you understand this clearly, you begin to realize something very important. You are not struggling with life itself. You are interacting with life through a programmed filter. Let's make this simple. Imagine two people receive the same opportunity to earn more money. One immediately feels excitement and begins thinking, "How can I make this work?" The other immediately feels doubt and thinks, "People like me don't succeed at things like this." The opportunity is identical, but the response is completely different. That difference is not intelligence. It is not education. It is subconscious programming. This programming is what Bob Proctor often referred to as a paradigm. A paradigm is simply a mental habit. It is a collection of beliefs, memories, and emotional associations that create automatic behavior, and because it is automatic, most people never question it. They just live inside it. Now here is the key point that changes everything. Your results in life will never rise above the level of your self-image. Your self-image is the mental picture you hold of yourself deep inside. It is not what you say you are. It is what you feel you are when no one is watching. If your self-image is "I am not good with money," then even if you earn more, you will unconsciously find ways to lose it, waste it, or avoid managing it properly. Not because you want to fail, but because your subconscious is always trying to stay consistent with your identity. This is why people often repeat the same financial patterns again and again. They change jobs, they change cities, they change strategies, but the underlying identity remains the same, and so the results remain the same. Now let's go deeper into how these patterns are formed. Your subconscious mind learns through repetition combined with emotion. Repetition alone is not enough. Emotion alone is not enough. But when you repeat something while feeling it strongly, it begins to sink into your subconscious as truth. For example, a child who repeatedly hears "money is hard to get" while seeing stressed adults around money does not just remember the words, they absorb the emotional environment. Over time, they do not just believe money is hard, they feel it is hard, and that feeling becomes their operating system. Later in life, even if they consciously want wealth, they are emotionally aligned with struggle. And the subconscious always follows emotion, not logic. This is why knowledge alone does not change a life. You can read every book on success and still live in limitation if your emotional conditioning remains the same. So the real question becomes, how do you change something that has been programmed over years? You do not change it with force. You change it with awareness and repetition. Let's start with awareness. One of the most practical things you can do is begin observing your automatic thoughts throughout the day, not judging them, just noticing them. Especially the ones that repeat. You might notice thoughts like "this is too expensive," "I am not ready," or "people like me don't get those opportunities." These thoughts feel like truth, but they are actually recorded patterns. When you observe them without reacting, something powerful happens. You create space between you and the program, and in that space, change becomes possible. Most people are not aware of their thoughts. They are inside them, and when you are inside a thought, you cannot question it. You can only obey it. Awareness is the first step out of automatic living. Now let's talk about reprogramming. Reprogramming the subconscious does not happen through one dramatic moment. It happens through consistent emotional repetition of a new idea about yourself. For example, instead of trying to force yourself to think "I am rich" when you don't feel it, you begin with something believable but slightly expanded. You might say, I am learning how to manage money better, or I am becoming someone who handles money wisely. This matters because the subconscious accepts ideas that feel emotionally believable. If there is too much resistance, it rejects them. So the goal is not exaggeration. The goal is gradual identity expansion. Then, you reinforce this new identity through small daily actions. If you want to change your financial identity, you start by making small decisions that reflect responsibility. You track your spending, you delay unnecessary purchases, you educate yourself about money consistently. These actions seem small, but they are not small to the subconscious mind. They are signals. Every action says, "This is who I am now." Over time, repetition of these actions creates emotional evidence, and emotional evidence is what updates self-image. Now let's connect this to confidence. Confidence is not something you wait to feel. It is something you build through keeping agreements with yourself. When you say you will do something small and you consistently follow through, your subconscious begins to register you as reliable. That internal reliability becomes confidence. Many people try to build confidence by thinking differently. But real confidence is built through identity proof. You show yourself, repeatedly, that you can trust your own behavior. Now here is something important to understand. When you begin changing your identity, you will experience resistance. Old habits will try to reassert themselves. You may feel doubt, hesitation, or even emotional discomfort. This is not failure. This is identity conflict. Two versions of you cannot dominate at the same time. The old identity tries to maintain control through familiarity. The new identity tries to emerge through repetition and action. The tension you feel is simply the transition process. If you persist calmly without overreacting, the new identity gradually stabilizes. Let's bring this into everyday life in a simple way. If someone has a self-image of being disorganized, they will constantly experience clutter, missed deadlines, and stress. Even if they clean their environment once, the deeper identity will recreate disorder over time. But if they begin to shift their identity by saying, I am someone who organizes my life daily, and then take small consistent actions like cleaning their desk for 5 minutes each day, they begin to slowly overwrite the old pattern, not all at once, but steadily. This is how real transformation works. It is not a sudden change in behavior, it is a gradual change in identity expression. Now the deeper truth is this: your external life is always a reflection of your internal identity. Not your potential, not your wishes, your identity. This means if you want to change your life, you must be willing to change the image you hold of yourself. And that change does not come from pretending. It comes from building new evidence through aligned action and emotional repetition. So the practical path is simple, but not always easy. First, become aware of your current patterns without judgment. Second, choose a slightly expanded version of yourself that feels believable. Third, reinforce that identity through small, consistent actions. And fourth, repeat this process until the new identity feels natural. Over time, what once felt like effort becomes normal behavior. And when something becomes normal, it becomes your paradigm. That is when life changes, not through force, but through alignment.